The first winter I lost a colony. I prepared it in November. Wrapping, reduced entrance, upper ventilation, everything the book said. It died in February. The next year I did the same thing earlier, in October, on the theory that I had simply been late. That one died too. The third year I changed something, and the losses stopped. And the thing I changed was not anything I did in November. It was something I did in August. This is not a story about insulation, and it is not a story about doing the same work sooner. The 2 colonies I lost were, as far as I could tell in November, in good condition. They had bees, stores, a queen. Everything I could measure in November said they were fine. Everything I could have measured in August would have said they were not. What I did that 3rd August took an afternoon and no equipment. I walked the yard with a hive tool, counted, and acted on the 2 colonies where the count came up short. That is the whole of it, nothing to buy, which is probably part of why it stopped being taught. November preparation felt correct to me because it is when the work is visible. I could see the wrap go on. I could feel the weight of the hive. I could watch the entrance narrow and tell myself the colony was protected in a way it had not been the day before. All of that is real work, and none of it is wasted. But it operates on the last week of a process that started months earlier, and if the earlier part went wrong, no wrap fixes it. If this kind of biology first breakdown is useful to you, a like helps more beekeepers find it. There is a quieter reason it feels right too. November is the last point when I can do something about winter and still believe it will work. By then, the colony is fixed. Nothing I add changes its population, the age of its bees, or what is in the combs. I can protect what is there. I cannot alter it. Protecting a colony assembled wrong is a way of preserving a mistake very carefully through to February. So here is the August measurement, because you should not have to wait until the end for something you can use. I count backwards from my first killing frost date. 2 months before that date, a colony you intend to winter should have enough brood to fill 3 to 4 full-depth frames. Not bees covering 3 or 4 frames. Brood, in cells, at that moment. I did not invent that standard, and it is a hard threshold rather than a target. Below it, a colony will not produce the population it needs before the queen shuts down. The reason to measure 2 months out rather than in October is that 2 months is roughly how long it takes for a decision to become a population. Short in August, and you still have options. In October, the number is simply the number. Counting takes less time than it sounds, because you are answering a yes or no rather than measuring. Lift the frames from the middle of the nest. Estimate how much of each is occupied by brood in any stage. Add the partial frames together. 3 frames worth spread across 6 frames of comb counts. If a colony comes up clearly short, the answer is not to feed it harder. It is to unite it while brood rearing is still running, so the combined colony has time to produce the bees it needs. Uniting in August is a decision. Uniting in November is salvage. One thing before we go further. If this is useful, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the platform that careful, historically grounded beekeeping is worth showing to more people. And if you want to support the work more directly, joining the channel is a little like buying us a coffee. No grand promises attached. The comments are where I find out how this maps onto other climates, and frost dates vary enough that it matters. If your first frost runs a month either side of mine, say so. The material behind this video is also public. The bulletins are old enough that anyone can read them. The August number is not something I worked out. It comes from a body of work that was published, completed, and then very largely forgotten. In 1918, The United States Department of Agriculture put out 2 wintering bulletins in the same year. One on preparing colonies to winter outdoors, one on wintering them in cellars. Same 2 authors, an apiculturist named Phillips and his assistant Demuth, resting on research they had been publishing since 1914, on what actually happens to the temperature of a winter cluster. Taken together, they are not advice. They are a system, set out from first principles by people who had measured what they were describing. What makes them unusual is the order the work was done in. The temperature research came first. In 1914, they instrumented wintering colonies and measured what the cluster actually does, rather than assuming it. The practical bulletins came afterwards, built on those measurements. That is the reverse of how beekeeping advice usually gets made, then and now. A practice works for somebody, spreads, and acquires an explanation later. And both bulletins say the same thing, in almost the same words at the start. 3 things must be present in abundance: stores of good quality, protection from wind and cold, and room for the queen to rear brood at the right times. Then the sentence I never see quoted with them: if any one of the 3 is missing, the other 2 will not save the colony, and the crop of the following season is already reduced. Not the colony's survival, the following season's crop. They were measuring the cost of a bad winter in honey a year later. It is a stronger claim than it sounds. Not that all 3 help, that they are not additive at all. A colony given 2 of the 3 is not 2/3 prepared. It is unprepared, and the effort spent on the 2 is largely wasted. Now the part that reverses what most of us were taught. Those 2 men measured the temperature of the air immediately around a wintering cluster, and found that the bees do the least work, burn the least stores, wear themselves out least, when that air sits at 57 degrees Fahrenheit. Not at freezing, not in the 40s, 57. And they were explicit that any temperature below 40 is invariably bad for bees. That finding is the hinge of the whole system, and it is the opposite of the instinct almost everyone carries into autumn, that a colder colony is a quieter colony, and a quieter colony eats less. The measurements said otherwise. A cluster held against deep cold is not resting. It is working, continuously, all winter. And the bill comes due in the population that walks out in March. I want to be precise about what was measured, because I have seen the number repeated loosely. This is not the temperature inside the cluster, which the bees regulate and which stays far higher. It is the air immediately around the cluster, the environment the colony works against. Near the high 50s and the colony essentially rests. Down in the 30s, and it spends the winter generating heat it will not get back. The reason this is counterintuitive is that we picture the cluster as a small stove heating a large box. It is not. The cluster heats itself and almost nothing else. The far corners of a wintering hive are close to outside temperature, and always have been. Insulation does not warm the hive. It slows the escape of heat the bees generate for themselves, and in doing so, lets the cluster loosen. A loose cluster can move on to fresh stores. A cluster held tight against cold cannot move at all, which is how a colony starves with honey 2 inches away. That is not a failure of stores, but of temperature, and the 2 look identical in March. The structure of the cluster makes the point. A wintering cluster has a dense outer shell of bees packed tight, and a looser core where the temperature is held. The shell is insulation, made of bees, and the colder the surrounding air, the thicker and tighter that shell has to be. Those are bees taken out of the loose interior and pressed into service as a wall. A colony in a well-protected box holds a smaller shell, and a larger, more mobile interior. The same colony in a thin box holds a thick shell and a small core. The same bees doing more work with less of themselves free to move. Which brings up the error those bulletins warned about most insistently, and which modern practice has almost exactly inverted. They identified excessive ventilation as one of the most serious faults a beekeeper could commit. Not because air is bad for bees, but because heavy ventilation causes the temperature inside to swing. And it is the swinging, rather than the cold itself, that costs the colony. Their instruction was that in a properly insulated space, very little ventilation is needed at all. Today, the standard advice runs the other way. Ventilate hard, keep them dry, moisture is the killer. Part of that is a genuine correction of a real problem. But somewhere in the handing down, the second half of the instruction fell off, and colonies now get wintered in boxes that are well ventilated, poorly insulated, and swinging hard between afternoon and dawn. The correction was real, and I would not talk anyone out of it. Colonies do die of condensation dripping onto the cluster, and top ventilation does prevent it. My problem was that a correction repeated long enough without its reasoning becomes a rule, and this rule has no upper limit. More ventilation gets treated as more safety. In 1918, the two were coupled. You manage moisture by managing temperature, because warm air holds water, and cold surfaces are where it collects. What makes this practical, rather than theoretical, is that the 1918 system gave the beekeeper a way to see it. Condensed moisture on the inner cover of a wintering hive was treated not as a ventilation problem, but as a temperature problem, proof that the colony was being kept too cold. Moisture on the floor of the hive was worse, and meant the same thing more urgently. That reframing changes what you do about it. If you read moisture as a ventilation failure, you open the hive up further, which drops the temperature, which produces more condensation, and you have entered a loop where every intervention makes the underlying condition worse while appearing to address the symptom. I ran that loop for 2 winters. Every year I added ventilation, and every year the covers were wetter. What broke the loop was inverting the reading. Instead of asking how to get the water out, I asked why the underside of the cover was cold enough for water to form on it. Once I put insulation above the cluster, instead of adding ventilation, the covers came out of winter dry. That is not a claim that ventilation is unnecessary. It is a claim about which is cause and which is symptom, and I had them the wrong way round for 2 winters. The second colony I lost, the October one, is the one that taught me the store's half of this, and it taught me badly because I had done the visible work correctly. It was wrapped early. It was heavy. I could barely tip the back of it. It had a laying queen in September. It died anyway, and when I finally broke it down in March, the frames still had capped honey in them. Dark honey, most of it from the goldenrod and aster flow that had come in that autumn. I had read the weight of that hive as a measure of preparedness, and it was nothing of the kind. It was a measure of how much late-season nectar had come in, which is a different quantity entirely, and I had made no distinction between the two. The distinction I had missed is one the 1918 material makes early and often. Stores have a quality as well as a quantity. 40 pounds of good honey and 40 of poor weigh the same at the back of the hive. They do not behave the same in a cluster that cannot fly for 4 months. That hive had weight. It did not have stores in any sense that mattered to it. The bulletins are unusually specific about stores, and the specificity is the useful part. The figure they give is 45 pounds of honey to carry a colony from the end of one season to the start of the next main flow, not through winter, through to the next flow, which is a longer and more expensive period than the phrase winter stores suggests. And a second figure I think matters more. At no point while brood is being reared Should a colony hold less than 15 pounds? That number governs the late winter and early spring weeks when a colony expands and consumes fastest. And it is where colonies that survive January are actually lost. On quality, they are direct. Fall flower honeys make poorer winter stores than clover, alfalfa, or raspberry, and honeydew is worse still. Where stores are doubtful, the remedy is sugar syrup, fed after brood rearing has finished, so it goes to store rather than into brood. The mechanism is simple once someone says it out loud. Bees confined for months cannot void outside the hive, and honeys higher in indigestible residue load the gut faster. A colony on poor stores needs a cleansing flight earlier, and if that point lands in a long cold spell, the result is dysentery, agitation, and a cluster that breaks itself apart trying to leave. A store's failure that looks like a cold failure. There is one line in that 1918 material I have never been able to improve on. Honey left in the hive for the bees, they wrote, is a better investment than money in the bank. I have taken a super off a colony in September that I should have left, more than once, and every time the arithmetic looked good in September and looked stupid in April. It is hard to act on because the cost is invisible at the moment of the decision. A super pulled in September is honey you can see, weigh, and sell. Honey left behind is an absence. You never learn what it bought, because what it bought is a colony that did not become a problem. There is no satisfying feedback for the right decision, which is why the wrong one keeps getting made. The half of the system that genuinely did disappear is the cellar, and it is worth understanding because of what it proves, rather than because anyone is going back to it. Commercial beekeepers in the coldest parts of the north carried colonies underground in November and brought them out at the end of March. Repositories dug into hillsides, hives stacked 4 high, 100 colonies to a cellar. It worked, and for the same reason outdoor packing works, the 1918 authors say so plainly, that a cellar is simply another way of putting insulation around the bees, except that it goes around the whole apiary rather than each hive. What killed it was not that it stopped working. It was labor, trucks, and a style of beekeeping in which colonies move to the crop rather than staying put. A method that means carrying every hive down a set of stairs twice a year does not survive contact with a truck. What stays with me is how quiet those cellars were meant to be. The instruction was to stay out. Carrying a colony out for a midwinter flight, which sounds humane, reliably started brood rearing and did more harm than the flight did good. And even jarring a hive could lift the cluster temperature enough to set the queen laying. A well-run bee cellar was a room the beekeeper deliberately did not enter for 4 months. I find that a strange discipline to imagine, when my own instinct at every point in the year is to go and look. The cellar work left behind something more useful than the cellars. A list of 12 checks that tell you whether wintering actually worked. Most cost nothing. A thermometer pushed into the entrance should read above the low 50s. No condensed water on the covers, and certainly none on the floor. Hold a candle at the entrance in late January, and the cluster should take several seconds to react. One that erupts immediately has been agitated all winter. Dead bees should lie on the ground directly beneath the entrance, pushed out by the living, rather than scattered widely. Scattered means they flew and did not return. And there should be no mold on the combs in spring, because a hive at the right temperature is too dry for mold. One more reframed the whole list for me. Winter loss inside a properly wintered colony was expected to be small. In the best case, something on the order of a few hundred bees across the entire winter. I sat with that number for a while, because it says the steady attrition I had been treating as normal winter cost is not a fixed price. It is a variable, and it is the variable the whole system was built to move. 2 of the 12 are worth more to me than the rest. The first, a colony taken out of winter should have no brood in it yet. Brood rearing that starts too early is not a sign of vigor. It is evidence that the colony was too cold or the stores were poor. A disturbed or chilled cluster begins rearing brood in response, and doing so in February on bad food is how dysentery and collapse begin. The second is bigger, and I wish I had met it earlier. Spring dwindling, the colony that has a queen, has brood, has stores, and simply shrinks through April while you watch, is treated in 1918 not as a spring problem at all, but as a diagnosis of the previous autumn. The population that emerges in March is the one built in September. If it dwindles, the bees that should have carried the colony to the first new brood were never properly made. You are not watching a colony fail in April. You are watching a decision made 7 months earlier, and nothing done in April addresses it. What I find useful is that it makes April an inspection rather than an emergency. If a colony dwindles in spring, the productive question is not what to feed it. It is what its brood nest was doing in September, and the answer changes what I do the following August, not what I do this week. 3 limits, and then I will stop qualifying. The first is the largest. There was no Varroa in North America in 1918, and a wintering system built on the assumption of structurally healthy bees does not transfer unchanged to colonies carrying mites. Everything in it about strength, stores, and temperature still holds, but it sits downstream of mite control rather than replacing it. A well-insulated colony with a heavy mite load in September dies well-insulated. Second, the temperature targets were worked out for the northern United States, and the numbers are climate-specific. In milder winters, insulation matters less, and the real risk becomes holding a colony too warm and too active. Third, insulation without attention to moisture can hurt, particularly in a sealed box with nowhere for vapor to go. The 1918 answer was insulation above the cluster specifically. It retains heat while letting vapor through, rather than a sealed lid. 2 of those 3 the original authors could not have addressed. The third they did, and their answer is more specific than the shorthand I was given. Insulation over the cluster, protection from wind, and do not seal the box. The sequence then, and almost all of it happens before the weather turns. In August, 2 months out from first frost, I count brood, 3 to 4 frames minimum, and if a colony is short, I unite it while brood rearing is still running, rather than nursing it into October. Requeen so a young queen is laying by that same 2-month mark. Through September, protect laying space so the queen can use it, and assess stores by quality rather than weight alone. In October, correct the stores if the fall honey is doubtful, feeding after brood rearing has stopped. Then, and only then, the insulation. Above the cluster first, wind protection second, restraint on ventilation rather than enthusiasm for it. The wrap is the last step and the least important, which is exactly backwards from the order it usually gets taught in. None of it takes long. The August count is an afternoon across a yard. The September assessment happens during inspections you were doing anyway. The October feeding is a week of attention, the insulation a morning. What it needs is not labor, but sequence, and sequence is the part that fell out of the handing down. What happened to this system interests me less than what happened to its pieces. It was not suppressed, and nobody argued it down. Packaged bees arrived, and migratory beekeeping arrived, and it became cheaper for a commercial operation to replace winter losses in spring than to engineer against them in autumn. The elaborate parts of the system, the cellars, the group packing cases, fell away because they did not survive contact with that economics. But the surviving parts traveled without their reasoning. We kept the wrap and the reduced entrance. We lost the calendar that says when the work starts and the number that explains why any of it is worth doing. Nobody was wrong either. A commercial operation that can buy packages in April and has no cellar is making a rational decision. But the reasoning behind that decision was made in a business context, and it traveled into hobby beekeeping where the economics are completely different. Somebody with 6 colonies losing 2 every winter is not saving money by replacing them. They are paying for someone else's logistics. The broader point is about where a wintering failure lives in time. Almost everything done in November preserves a condition rather than creating one. That condition, a large population of well-fed, unworn young bees on good stores laid by a queen at the right moment, either exists by early autumn or it does not. Insulation preserves it. Wind protection preserves it. Restraint preserves it. None of them make it. That is why my 3rd year worked, and my first 2 did not. And why the 2 colonies I lost looked fine in November. They looked fine because the wrapping was correct. What was underneath the wrapping had been decided in August, and I had not been there for it. It also explains why so much winter advice feels contradictory. Wrap or do not wrap. Ventilate or insulate. Feed or leave them. Those arguments are unresolvable when conducted about November, because in November, they are arguments about how best to preserve something already determined. Moved back to August, most of them stop being controversial, because they become questions about population and stores, which I can measure. I still wrap. I still reduce entrances, and I still watch the weather in November like everyone else. But the work I actually count on now happens in the last week of August with a hive tool in my hand, counting frames of brood and doing arithmetic against a frost date. It is unglamorous, and it takes me an afternoon across a whole yard. Have you ever lost a colony that looked perfectly prepared going in, and looking back, do you know what its brood nest was doing in August? Leave it in the comments. Subscribe for more historically grounded beekeeping, and if you want the full breakdown of how winter bees are physically built and what stops that process early, that one is next.